My name is Irena Swanson, and today I want to show you how to make these square-in-square blocks of finished size 4 inches. I made 12 of each of these 5 colors, so there's a total of 60 blocks, and I sewed these 60 blocks with my two-piecing method with only 22 seams total. That's really fast and it's also accurate. I use my method called two-piecing. With traditional methods, you would make each of these squares with 4 seams, so the 60 blocks would take 240 seams, which is, well, it takes more pieces to worry about and it takes longer. The two-piecing method is really very accurate. And you can find out more about two-piecing on my other in my other videos on YouTube channel. I also have 3 books, and in particular this thick book, Streamlining in Quilting, is all about streamlining methods in quilting, not just two-piecing. And the last chapter talks more generally, not just about these what I call 1-by-1 blocks in different sizes, but also more generally about, well, it could be a 3-by-1 block, but without these redundant seams in the middle, or it could be 3-by-2 blocks or 5-by-7 blocks and so on. So look at that chapter. The other thing about that chapter, it's not just square in square, but there are other 1-by-1 blocks. Here in this storm at sea, this is also a 1-by-1 block with not right angles. Here is another 1-by-1 block, and here is another 1-by-1 square in square block in a different size. Okay. So anyway, back to these square in square blocks. In this video, I will show you, you either make 60 of them, or you only choose 4 colors, so you'll make 48 of them only, 12 times 4, or 5 times 4, and I'll explain why these numbers. Yeah, there are more of these over here. There is a total of 48 of them. Now, how do we start? Well, let's look at these squares more carefully. So I do happen to have a 4.5-inch square, but if you don't have one of these, just make yourself maybe a plastic template or maybe a paper template. On the plastic template, I also marked the corners where the expected inner square is. Here I also could have marked over there. And let's look at this more carefully. So here's the finished square. So this diagonal of the square is expected 4 inches. So this length here is 4 divided by square root of 2 inches. And then if you also add the seam allowance around these strips that you will cut, that will be 3 inches and 5/16 of an inch. So 5/16 of an inch is between the 1/4 and 3/8 of an inch. So there's no notch between eighths in typically. So 5/16 or is in between there. Anyway, so all of these strips, for all the, either choose 4 different strips, 4 or 5 different strips of the inner square fabric. They can all be different, and you cut them from selvage to selvage at strip width 3 and 5/16 of an inch. Now, of the corner fabrics, you want all corner fabrics to be from the same fabric, so you will cut either 5 of those strips, or if you do only 4 colors, then 4 of those strips. Now, what's the strip width of those? If you are experienced with this method and a very accurate sewer, the minimum strip width is 5 3/4 of an inch. but for as a beginner, you want to start with 6.5 inches or maybe even a little bit bigger, and I will explain why. But all widths, either all 5 of those strips or all 4 of those strips, all of them have to be of the same width, whichever you pick, 5 3/4 of an inch to 6.5, 6 3/4 of an inch. You don't need more than 6 3/4. Okay, so you cut those strips and you sew them together. Here I have 5 fabrics for the inner squares and 5 fabrics for the outer squares, and I tried to line them up at the top near my face here as much as possible, but then at the bottom some of my strips were cut from leftovers from something else, so some of them are longer, but that's okay, it doesn't matter. Okay, so once you have the strips sewn, then you want to press them. You either press them all to one side or all towards the dark fabrics, it doesn't really matter. Once the backs are all pressed, then you want to trim at the top accurately, perpendicular to all the seams in the strip sets. Okay? And you want to cut as close as possible to the top. So pretend that we already did the trimming. I'm a little too generous right now, but it makes it easier to hold it down. And once you have this, then you sew the 2 outer strips together, so you get a tube. So you sew these 2 together, then it will be a tube, and this is where tube piecing comes in. Right? So now that you have a tube, this is a sewn tube. It is indeed a tube. Here you see the insides. It's a tube, and you want to press the latest seam in any way you want to, but you do want to press. And then you want to cut across again just to stabilize the top. Here I still left a little bit of a selvage earlier. Now you may want to trim this. All the cuts now will be into narrow tubes, and you want to make sure that all the cuts are perpendicular to all the seams and to the 2 edges. So you need to take your long ruler, which I did not bring here, and you cut across. Okay? And the width of the tubes is the same as the width of the inner squares, so 3 5/16 of an inch. And if you started with strips cut from selvage to selvage, you will get 12 of these tubes. I have 7 of them here, 1 here, and 4 here already stacked. Right. So again, and then there are some leftovers which I'm sure you'll be able to use for something. Okay. So the advantage of tubes is that they can roll around. If this is just a strip, then you either sew it together this way or that way. But with a tube, you have some ability to rotate, to temporarily go into the 3rd dimension before it can settle down back into the 2-dimensional world where we like our quilts. Okay, so here's the original. And now we want to sew these tubes back together. And say if we have something like this, or let's do it this way and that way, if we sew them properly, then we will be able to cut out the pieces. Alright, so the positioning of these squares relative to each other is very important. Okay. So the next step is preparing for the next 11 seams. The first 12 seams were easy, right? The first 10 seams. But then the next ones, we have to do a little more care. We have to prepare for how we will stagger the tubes relative to each other. So what I did here, I have 4 of these narrow tubes stacked on top of each other, and I'm lining up the blocks exactly as much as I can. And then from my point of view, if I am pressed for fabric, I don't have very much, then I'll do here, I'll take a pen and I'll measure down, down here 3/4 of an inch. So I line up my ruler 3/4 of an inch along this seam, and then I mark in all these margins. Oh, by the way, I did stagger these tubes so the seam allowance for a little less is showing here from the one underneath. So I measure 3/4 of an inch down here, also 3/4 of an inch down there. If your original strips were 6.5 inches or more generous, then you can go down to 1 1/16 of an inch. So I would mark down further down here and also down there. So this is just one side. Below each of these squares, you want to mark whatever it is, all 3/4 of an inch or all 1/16 of an inch or whatever you choose in between depending on the width of your strips. Okay, now, but this marks only one side. If I take this tube and rotate it to the other side, I also have to mark either 3/4 of an inch or 1 1/16 of an inch down here and also down there. Okay, and so if I want to do similar stacking to what I did here is I will take the next tube and put it in here, or actually I would take all of these and stack them here, maybe 4 at a time or maybe just 1 at a time. Oops, this should be lined up better. And then do the remaining markings. Once all of the tubes are marked, then you will sew the tubes together. When you're sewing the tubes together, you make sure that all your notches are on the right side. And when you sew this together, so the notches are on the right, so the notch is here on the right, but when I sew, now the notch on this is on the left, but it's on top. And so then what I'll do is I have this square, the next square, whichever color doesn't matter here. I have to mark the seam on the beginning of my next block here. I line it up with a mark down there, and then the next square, the top of the next square, I don't know if you can see, the top of the next square is matched with the notch on the bottom, and so on. I sewed this all together, and because and when I open this seam, the notches now on this pair will still be on the right side. Okay. So you sew all these tubes together, and you get one of these tubes. This tube here has wider background fabrics, strips for background fabrics. This one has narrow background fabrics. So here, these distances here are just 3/4 of an inch. On this one, the distances are 1 1/16 of an inch. Okay. So whichever you do. Now, let's do it here. Now you can start to see the blocks. Here is one block, and here's a neighbor block, and here's yet another neighbor block, etc. And we could start cutting these blocks out, but there is the backing fabric. We are in a tube, so we don't want to cut through both layers. So this is a pain. So we want to, cutting on tubes is not the nicest thing to do. Similarly, it would happen here. So as soon as possible, we want to convert this tube into a flat piece. So if we could cut across this way, so here's, I don't have to cut all the way around. All I have to do, is maybe cut around here, and then the next one maybe I'll cut here, but I don't have to cut all the way down here. I'll just go down here, all right? So I do this zigzag cut all the way across, but let me be a little more careful. Wherever this last cut is here, so actually in this case it helps that these colors are all yellow. So we have this progression, yellow. So maybe in the last one here, I want yellow here and then the pale green on above it. So here the cut is above the green, sorry, above the yellow. So I want on this side the cut to be below the yellow. So I want the zigzag, if it goes up here, I could go something like this and then up here, or actually the colors don't really matter. So in the colors, maybe I want the zigzag to go up to this other one, but again the cut has to be below the block. Here the cut is above the block, here it's below the block. Okay, so once I make this cut, well, all right, let's go back a little more. My tube is not yet pressed, so this cutting across might be a little wonky. If you just smooth things out, then it'll probably be okay. Or another way is if you just press the tube in the area where you will do that first cut, then the pressing on this tube won't be too difficult. All right. But once you make the full cut, as I did over here, I did the full cut across. So this is the top part. You can see both the top and the bottom part. Once you do a full cut, then you can go and press the back. And once you have everything pressed, now it's much easier to cut out the blocks. But what happens to the blocks here along the edges? Well, they're not complete. Remember, this used to be part of the narrow tube that we cut out, and there is the other part. So the last seam that we will have to do is sew this edge to the other edge, right? Well, but then if we do that, we'll have another tube, so we want to avoid this tube. And here's a trick for how to avoiding that last tube. Just like we did before across the tube, we did a zigzag cut. Similarly, you do now a zigzag cut across here with your templates. You do the cuts, maybe this one and that one and that one, and maybe go here, 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 here. You can either cut the whole blocks or just parts of the blocks on one side. And then once you have this in two pieces, then it'll be easy to sew this edge to that edge. And so here it is, this cut that I did across. So we still have the two parts. Okay, and then I can leave the blocks in the middle, but then I take this top part. All right, there are more. Okay, so now we liberate this top part. It's still held in some places, and here, and here. Oh, it's so secure. One more. So now, no, it's held one more place. And one more. All right. So now, and one more. That was an overkill, wasn't it? So we take this part. This used to be part of a primary narrow tube, and we sew it to this flat part here, this X primary narrow tube. Well, you have to do the putting it together. Again, there should be marks along one of these must be the other one. And then you sew them together, and then what you have is a few blocks already cut out, and the rest is a jagged parallelogram. And from this you now cut out the rest of the blocks. Anyway, I hope that you enjoyed this explanation of how to make square and square blocks, 1x1 blocks of finished size 4 inches. Anyway, this is two-piecing. It makes a lot of blocks with very precise method. And whenever I use my two-piecing method, usually with so many strips, maybe I don't use all the parts in here. So with very few remnant extra seams, I made this baby quilt from the remnants. And here's a bonus part. I'll show you other P by Q blocks. So here's 60 more of these 4-inch square finished square and square blocks. Isn't it gorgeous? And I will show you now a few other, not just 1x1 blocks, but other blocks. So here is, let's see, this is 3x2. Can you see 3x2 blocks? There are 11 of them. With traditional methods, that the 11 blocks would be sewn with 17 times 11 seams or 18 times 11 seams, many seams. With my method, I made it was fewer than 30 seams, and then 11 blocks needed to be cut out in the fussy way. Here is a quilt with 5x2 blocks. These are slanted parallelograms, so they're not square anymore. But here are 1x1 blocks, not squares and squares, but they're squares in parallelograms. These are 2x1 and these are 3x1 blocks. There are no seams in between them, no seams here, so my method makes these very fast. Here in the center are 4x2 blocks, and then there's 3x2. There are also some 3x3 blocks here. Right. These are some different 3x3 blocks. I'm having fun testing my method and how it works. Here are more 3x3 blocks. Maybe I should show more. I guess. Alright, see the whole quilt. And then that chapter, last chapter of my book, also has split P by Q blocks. So far, in all the blocks, there are no pieces into the corners. But when you have a split P by Q block, then there are seams going into the corners. So this is a split 1, 2, 3 by 1, 2, 3. Split 3x3 blocks. You see how these are different from the grandmother square 3x3? So in the grandmother square by 3, there are no seams going in here. But in this one, there are. Okay. Some other split 3x3 blocks are what is traditionally called broken dishes quilts. So individual quilts here are 3x3 blocks, but I make this even faster, not just by blocks. This is in the penultimate chapter of my streamlining book. And then there are also a half or 5.5 by something blocks. And for these, by the definition of a half, the seams do come into the corners. So here's a seam, here's another seam, seam, seam. And this is 4 by a half block. And some of them are turned the other way. cute, isn't it? Flying geese. These are 1.5 block, so seams come into the corner. But I made these flights of geese with even faster methods, not as blocks, but as whole rows. And again, this is in the penultimate chapter of my streamlining book. Then there are many by a half, so these are rows of half square triangles. That's also, again, when you make rows of them, it doesn't have to be blocks. Anytime you have rows of triangles, that is something by a half. So here the rows are actually at this angle. So here's one row and here's the other row in the mirror image. And when you sew these many by half rows together, you can get all over triangles like these pyramids. And, well, I'm done. All right, I hope that you enjoyed this extra part. Thank you for listening.